Hi. So, for the past 20% of my life, I guess, I've been working as an assistant to someone who's severely disabled. Severely disabled isn't like a technical term, it's just the term that I would use to describe somebody who's like physically disabled and doesn't have any way of communicating through words, whether it's like writing or speech or sign language or like anything else. Um, I make that distinction, I guess, because most disabled people can communicate with language in some way. And so it is a little different when somebody can't really state what their opinion on something is, really at all. Like, the person that I work for obviously can, like, express stuff with her body language, so, she can express things that she likes or doesn't like or how she feels about things, but if I'm going to come and, like, say my opinions, I just want to distinguish that, like, they're not hers. I don't know what her opinions are. Like, I was thinking of having her be in the video with me, but I felt like that might be boring for her, and even more, it would give the impression that I'm speaking for her, and I don't know how she feels about this stuff. These are just my opinions. Anyway, I wanted to complain. Frequently, she and I get in interactions with strangers or acquaintances where they do something that really pisses me off and shows their shitty attitude about disability, but I don't say anything because I feel like there's not really much benefit to just trying to yell at some random person. It just creates drama because random people going about their daily lives don't necessarily want to be educated and aren't in that frame of mind. Also, several years ago, I used to read the blog The Deal with Disability. It was by this woman named Eva who has cerebral palsy, and she had a lot of similar experiences, I think, to what my boss has, with people approaching her and doing and saying all these weird things. And at one point, somebody asked her, like, oh, how come you don't, like, try to educate these people, and how come your aides don't educate them? And she was like, actually, I tell my aides not to. If I remember right, I think she just kind of felt like it wasn't a good space to educate people, and she didn't want to cause drama. She just didn't want to be in like an uncomfortable situation just to try to educate people. I hope I'm quoting her right. That's what I remembered. Anyway, I took that to heart, and I always thought, well, if I'm trying to support my boss, like, I don't want to cause drama. Like, that's not really supporting her to like have a good day or like be part of the community. If I'm starting fights with people, that's not my job. So that's why I have to come on the internet and vent. Anyway, we have a lot of interactions with people that I think suck. I've made a list. I'm just going to read from it. I think a really big thing is when people come up to someone with a disability and they try to help them with physical tasks without asking. There's like 3 reasons why you shouldn't do this. First of all, you are touching somebody or their wheelchair, usually, without asking. You shouldn't touch people without asking, even if they're disabled and even if you think they need help. Second of all, they may not actually need help, and you may be getting in their way. You may not really understand the situation or the logistics of what's going on because, like, you're not in a wheelchair yourself, and you may actually get in their way. The third thing is, just because someone may have more difficulty doing something or do something slower doesn't mean that it's not still important to them to do it themselves. Like, it just is, And like for my boss, there's a lot of things that it takes her longer to do or that she's still learning to do, but that doesn't mean that like there's no reason for her to do them. Like, it's actually important, Like, so one thing that has always bothered me is her family and I always try to encourage her to press buttons, like press buttons to open electronic doors or press the button for an elevator. And like, as she's slowly trying to press the button, if another person is around, the other person will, like, 90% of the time run up and, like, push the button for her. And it's just, it sucks because they're taking away her independence and her chance to do it for herself. And there's just no thought put into it. They're not really looking at her and being like, oh, does this person actually need my help? They're like, oh, there's a disabled person, I'll help. And they just like run and do it. And they're taking something away from her, and then there's like nothing that you can say to these people because they're always like, oh, I just thought I was being helpful. Like, they think that that makes them like totally above criticism. I know that sounds like a bit whiny of me to complain about this, but it happens so much and like with so many different things. And I think what's so frustrating about it is because of this circumstances, like, you can never like really correct the person's assumptions or behavior because they're just not ready to hear it and they're just not thinking about it. And it's just so frustrating. I just, ugh, so many things are coming to mind of times that people have done this. Another thing that sucks is when people assume that anyone they meet who is disabled is a child. The other day, someone referred to my boss as a little girl, and she's 28 years old, and she's a fairly short woman. She's like 5 feet tall, but she definitely doesn't look like a little girl. Like, if someone thought she was like 15 or something, okay, but she's not the size of a little girl, and it really irritates me. Like, first of all, I think a lot of people who are disabled, some conditions can cause people to have different facial features that, might look different, like Down syndrome. I can imagine a lot of random people who don't know a lot of people with Down syndrome might have trouble telling how old someone with Down syndrome is by looking at their face. So there's that, and then there's also the fact that sometimes people with physical disabilities and illnesses might be smaller than you'd expect from somebody their age. So for me, if I meet someone who's disabled, I'd actually assume that they're older than I think they look like they are. But even aside from that, like, if someone's the size of an adult or a teenager, they're probably not a little child. And, like, it just is really frustrating because it comes off like people just expect any disabled person that they meet to be a child. And I know this might sound like an overreaction, but, like, this is something that I see as such a major, like, universal issue. Like, there's so much less in the way of services for developmentally disabled adults than kids. Like, when people turn 22 and age out of school, they age out of so many services. And, like, there's so many people who want to help developmentally disabled kids, and they don't think about developmentally disabled adults, or they're uncomfortable. And it just sucks. And I sort of see the same thing when people think that everyone with a developmental disability must be a child, and they don't consider that the person is an adult. Just look at the person in front of you and consider that they may not be a child. They may be an adult. Okay? Another thing is, please consider that even if you look at someone and you think, oh, that's the severely disabled kid that I went to school with or something, like, even if you think that they look like someone you know, don't argue with their staff or family when they say, no, this is a different person. Like, I've had this experience with people. Like, they're like, oh, your client, like, I used to be her teacher or something. And, like, I'll talk to them, and it's obvious that, like, she's not the right age or whatever. Like, she's obviously not the person they think she is. And, like, yeah, it's like, so do you think I'm lying, or are you just, like, unable to conceive that there's actually just a lot of people that might have similar disabilities? Like, maybe there's just a lot of people with disabilities and they're all distinct individuals, and this isn't the one disabled person that you can think of, it's actually someone else, I also don't like when people assume that somebody has a bad life or needs pity or prayers just because they are disabled. One time, when I was first working for my boss and I was more confrontational, we were walking down the street. This man came up, and as I was pushing her in her wheelchair, he put his hand on her shoulder. First of all, like, even if you want to be friendly, don't come up and touch somebody that you don't know, especially without even looking at them or approaching them or looking at their body language. Like, hopefully you wouldn't do that to any other woman that you see, so don't do it to a woman who's disabled and think that it's fine. So he put his hand on her shoulder, he, like, leaned in really close, and he was like, hang in there. And I was like, she's fine. And he was like, oh, I'm just looking out for her. And I think because I was first working for her, I was a little bit defensive. I was like, excuse me, like, why are you looking out for her? What do you think is happening? And he got super mad at me. And he was like, I was just trying to be friendly. Everyone these days is such a fucking phony. Like, he blew up at me, and he was, like, continuing to yell at me. And he was basically like the Holden Caulfield of people who randomly approach people with disabilities and put their hands on their shoulder. That's, like, a good example of why I don't want to be confrontational to people, because he got super mad. But, everyone has a tough life. I'm sure there are times when everyone appreciates being told, like, hang in there, you're doing great, good for you. But, you shouldn't assume just because someone is disabled that you should like approach them and say this. You don't really know what their life is like, and it's weird. And I think especially when there's sort of this spiritual aspect to it, like, oh, could I pray for you? Specifically because you're disabled, or like, oh, seeing you or seeing this person has really made me realize that I should feel like so blessed that God made me the way I am. And it's just like, wow, do you really think that God like is like, oh, okay, here's disabled people, but here's you and you're not disabled, so therefore I'm like really blessing you or something? Can't you just think that everyone is probably spiritually equal? Yeah. Another thing I really don't like is when people compliment me or imply that I'm doing the kind of work I do because I'm a good person, or that I'm going to get good karma or something for being a support worker. Honestly, I work as a support worker because I really like the person I work for, and it's just the kind of work I've always wanted to do. Like, I have a disability and I feel more comfortable around other people who have a disability. It's a fun job. I don't want to work in an office. I usually feel pretty uncomfortable and stiff if I have to like sit at a desk all day. Like, there's tough stuff about being a support worker, and honestly I feel like it has more to do with like the fact that, most support work jobs are quite low income. They're just not well funded. And I mean, I could talk about it a lot, but because they tend to be low income, it means that there's always a lot of turnover in them, because it's really difficult for somebody to like do it for their whole life, even if they want to. And anyway, that's like an actual problem. But I don't like when people approach me and assume that my work is like hard, or that I must be doing it because I'm a good person and not just because I'm doing the kind of work that I want to do. It's also it's frequently said in front of my boss as if she can't hear or understand. And I think that's really insulting and insensitive to her. Like, how would you feel if you were hanging out with like either somebody that works for you or just anybody in your life, and somebody came up and started telling them that they're a good person for being out with you? Like, it's just so shitty. Those are most of my complaints, I think. Another thing I don't like is when people have kind of like a one-size-fits-all idea of how to approach or talk to somebody. Now, this is kind of a more abstract thing, but my boss, we don't really know what her visual situation is like, because she can't really have like a typical like eye exam or anything, because she can't really communicate what she can see. But it kind of seems like a lot of the time she doesn't really see people unless they get like extremely close to her, like this close to her face. So I've known some other people with developmental disabilities who've really gotten to know my boss or gotten to know me or her family, and they just observed this about her. They observed that people that were close to her would always get really close to her to talk to her. So they started to do the same thing, and like she responded to them and they became closer. And sometimes staff or other people that are around who don't know my boss will be bossy to their clients and like think that because their client has a disability, they should tell them how to interact with someone. So they'll see them talking to my boss at close range and they'll be like, oh, get out of her face, you're bothering her, leave her alone. And that just really makes me crazy. It's like, okay, please don't, like, if you don't have the observational skills to like learn how to get to know my boss, okay, that's fine. But don't yell at your client because they figured out something about her that you missed. Yeah, that's about it. The big thing that I think many people would be bothered by is if you don't acknowledge the person with a severe disability and you just acknowledge the people that are with them. Even if the person can't talk or have a conversation with you, maybe you wouldn't be asking them questions or something like that because they can't answer, but, you should still act like they're there. Like, you shouldn't act like there's nobody else in the room. And I feel there's ways of including somebody in a conversation even if they can't say anything. And yeah, refusing to do that kind of sucks. Those are my complaints. I don't know if this video is super entertaining, but I just thought I'd make it because there's so many things that I want to say to people, but it's never really the right time to say it when it actually happens. So, whatever.